coat. And that good-looking gentleman with the Mona Lisa smile is none other than Frank Covino. That name speaks for itself. Go ahead, let's do the film.
Hi, my name is Frank Covino. I'm a portrait artist who teaches. I have a few degrees from Pratt Institute in New York City, and painting has been in my family since the Renaissance. There is a Covino portrait of Lorenzo de' Medici at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. I teach classical academic art, which is art as it was practiced for almost 5 centuries prior to Impressionism. It did, of course, start in Italy in the 15th century with such great artists as Leonardo da Vinci, Raphael Stanza, and the students of da Vinci like Bronzino and Perugino. It was a remarkable period of time, the Renaissance. What the word Renaissance means, of course, is a rebirth, and they speak of the rebirth of civility as it was practiced in the Roman first century. And of course the glory of Rome, or the grandeur of Rome, owes its glory to Greece, which it conquered. Rome was not a barbarian nation. When they conquered Greece, they hired the slaves to tutor them, since they recognized their form of government was a great form of government. It is the one we use today, in fact. They recognized that their statuary was supreme and beyond anything they'd ever seen before. The architecture was extraordinary. And so in bringing back slaves to Rome, they had them school the craftsmen of ancient Rome, and Rome became everything that Greece was prior to their conquering. Rome, of course, fell to a handful of barbarians, more than a handful. First to the Goths from the north, the Visigoths from the west, the Huns from the far east. And you may wonder why or how the greatest nation in the world could have been conquered so quickly by barbarians. While they were prideful in having conquered everything from Ireland to Greece, they made one mistake. They didn't protect their borders. And another in employing the Goths as soldiers in their own army. Of course, it wasn't long before they banded together and struck against Rome, together with the Greek captives in the south, led by Spartacus. And once the slaughter began, the word went all over Europe, and other barbarian nations came in, and Rome was quickly destroyed. What followed was almost 500 years of barbarianism. People lived by the sword and the hatchet. And barbarians, as they are known to do, burned every book, burned the libraries, destroyed the art, and it was 500 years of lack of education. How from all of this could the Renaissance arise? Well, it was largely due to a handful of monks who established high-walled communities in various parts of Europe and Ireland, and inside those communities brought the books from ancient Greece, the books that had schooled the Romans. The thoughts of Aristotle and Socrates and the great minds of ancient Greece were harbored in these high-walled communities, and the information was passed on by way of calligraphy. Since there were talented children in these walled communities, they were hired to produce or reproduce the books that schooled the ancient Greeks. The church was in trouble. How do you reach a nation that can't read and teach them the Christian ethic, well, the Pope was very wise to hire some of these young calligraphers to do paintings. There was no television, no radio. The only form of communication, visual communication, was paintings. And if a commission occurred, let's say commissioned by the Pope, for example, the word went all over Europe that a painter like Verrocchio inside one of these communities was about to embark upon the adventure of creating the baptism of Christ. And people would plan their vacations to be in Florence, for example. When the painting was exhibited, it was a great event. And through these Christian paintings, which for want of a better word became propaganda for the Roman Catholic Church, civilization gradually returned after 500 years of Holocaust. How quickly we forget. There were 70 million dead bodies lying on the European soil. 70 million. And of course the bodies brought the rats, and the rats brought the plague, and it was just a devastating time for 500 years. Gradually, the Renaissance rose, largely through the influence of the Pope and the hiring of painters to do religious paintings. The paintings were remarkably mathematical, based upon the information they acquired from great minds like Aristotle, whose teacher, of course, was Socrates, not the least of which was a proportion that was used for sculpture and for painting, called the golden mean ratio. It was Socrates who held his hand up to a class of young students one day and said, press your hand to a piece of paper and draw a box around it, and you're likely to find that the height in relation to the width is 1 to 1.618. This ratio is the very same ratio that we find on our fingers. The distribution of bones. The first knuckle in relation to the second is a 1 to 1.6 ratio. The second space in relation to the third, 1 to 1.6. And so it continues back to the first metacarpal bone, and in fact the hand itself in relation to the forearm is a 1 to 1.6 ratio. This ratio not only occurs upon the human form, but in many growing things, plants and seashells and things of that nature, and even in the spacing of the planets from the sun, with the first planet being 300 plus thousand miles from the sun, and the second 500 plus thousand miles, ours 800 plus thousand miles from the sun, the next one 13, 3, 5, 8, 13, each third number the sum of the previous two. That is the golden mean sequence. It came to be used then, in the Renaissance, by artists of all persuasions. Sculptors, for example, would approach an 8-foot block of marble and drill a hole at the 5th foot of 8. That became the navel, with 3 parts of body above, 5 parts of body below. And so the construction of the form continued, with the length of the hand in relation to the forearm, 1 to 1.6. With the length of the head in relation to the torso, 1 to 1.6. Startling how these statuaries, or this statuary was conceived, and we look at them today and say they are quite perfect. Of course, they are the classic perfect form, and few of us come close to that proportion, but they are truly beautiful. We're leading up to how the painters use this ratio, and how it's present in all the significant paintings, not just of the Renaissance, but the paintings for 5 centuries. The use of the golden mean was employed, first of all, in the selection of size. A painting 1 part tall and 1.6 parts wide became the favored ratio, whether it was horizontal or vertical. we have here what may be a very important painting. It has a signature that you may not recognize, but through spectral analysis and X-ray analysis, we have uncovered another signature that looks very much like Velazquez. Velazquez, of course, was classically trained, so the first thing you're going to see in the painting is the proportion I was just talking about. The golden mean ratio is not only visible in the height of the painting in relation to the whole, 1 to 1.6, but in the spacing of each individual set of forms. For example, we see a division here of 1 to 1.6, and within the left space, 1 to 1.6, the placement of the artist. Even in this mass of form, he puts another figure here to divide that space at 1 to 1.6, and does it again with the ground line in relation to the wall above it. It's quite classical, and all the great painters from the Renaissance through the 19th century, we're not talking, of course, of abstractionists, employed this principle in the design of their paintings, no matter what the subject matter was. This alone identifies it as a well-schooled artist, an artist who's been schooled in classical composition. And composition, of course, is where art begins. There are, as I have deciphered, at least 6 design principles that are consistent to all the great art for 5 centuries. And that begins with the principle of dominance, or what Aristotle called congruentia. Painting is significant if the whole of the painting is the sum of its individual parts, and they all need to be interrelated. Spatial division is only one of those considerations. A great painting has a dominant direction. It's not square, either vertical or horizontal. That direction is emphasized by the subject matter within the painting. If there's a dominant horizontal movement in the painting, balanced by an occasional vertical, it's considered to have passed that test of dominance of direction. Dominance of spatial size is another characteristic of good composition, and we see that again where the wall division here has created a dominant spatial size to the left of it as opposed to the one to the right, and also in the cluster of people on the right-hand side compared to the smaller cluster of the individual and his easel on the left-hand side. We have dominance of spatial divisions abounding within the composition. Dominance of shape is usually present in classical composition, and of course with each human figure echoed in the seated posture, we have a dominant repetition of shape. Dominance of value is one of the most critical parts of a good composition, a good classical academic composition. And when we speak of value, we're talking about measurements of light in 10% increments. If you were to squint your eye and imagine the painting related to a chart of gray values from black to white with 9 individual steps of gray in between, you could safely say the painting is dominantly a third value, meaning 30% light. This was a very important characteristic of the great paintings for 5 centuries. Does the painting have a dominant value? And surely this one does. It happens to be a low value, so it's called a low-key painting. But because there are elements in the composition that rise almost to white, it's called low major key. A low minor key would be a painting that's totally dark. The favored key of most of the painters for 5 centuries was low major. Most of the values very dark, with a couple of shots of light. This kind of distribution of light came to be known as chiaroscuro, from two Italian words, chiaro, meaning illuminated, and oscuro, meaning dark. The combination of dark and light, with the emphasis upon one, the emphasis upon the dark, came to be known as chiaroscuro. Many of the painters allowed their figures to gradually emerge from the darkness, with the painting being predominantly dark and a few shots of light in the significant areas. That came to be known as tenebrism, inspired by Caravaggio, and painters who painted in that manner often were referred to as Caravaggisti. One of those painters was Diego Velazquez. So we see his employment of that dominant value in the composition. Dominance of color was the next important consideration, and most of the masters prior to the pre-Raphaelite period chose a flesh palette as the dominant color of the painting. You may say, well, flesh is light. That's not necessarily true. It's only light when light is shining on it. And when light isn't shining on it, it can get to be quite dark, such as the shadows on the face. The brown tones, then, are just darker flesh tones. And for that reason, they chose brown as their dominant color. With flesh as the dominant color, they could introduce other colors in the composition, but the essential palette was the flesh palette. Dark-valued flesh tones, light-valued flesh tones. When the Impressionists came on the scene, they agreed with these classical academicians that there should be a dominant color, but they argued it doesn't have to be brown. And so we see something quite different happening in the latter part of the 19th century with the Impressionists. But this is a painting based upon the early classical academic principles introduced by such great minds as Leon Battista Alberti in his book Treatise on Painting from the 15th century. Not only were these books important in delivering principles of design and composition, but also important in delivering information to make a painting last for centuries. With Cennini, for example, advising us to put a ground over the support on which we paint, whether it be canvas or wood. The ground was a gesso that was made by boiling the skin of a sheep to create a glue, and mixing into that dust from the marble chippers. Marble dust is created when you chip marble, and it's basically a calcium carbonate substance. When they mix that with the skin, the boiled skin of a sheep, and the little plaster of Paris, they developed a ground that would protect the canvas and keep it from, or keep the oils from permeating and going to the back of the linen if it was a stretch canvas, which would of course deteriorate the linen. So the ground was absolutely important in separating the oils from the support on which it was painted. Although the supports of the 15th century were almost totally wood, when paintings were commissioned for a more extensive space, a greater amount of space, there was no wood to accommodate, so they went to stretch canvas, but they made sure that they would cover the canvas with the same substance called gesso, and Cennini tells us that gesso must have porosity and tooth. Porosity so that the oils will cling to it, and tooth to permit the painter to blend well. So for centuries, that's what protected paintings. It's unusual to find a painting from this date with so little cracking. It's remarkably preserved, so it must have been painted over gesso ground such as Cennini described. Apart from that, there's a remarkable resemblance to the artist with Velazquez himself, which can be viewed in the painting of La Meninas, where he is standing at his easel with a group of children around. Take a look at that, and you will see a remarkable resemblance. This particular painting is smaller than most Velazquez that exist today, and for that reason it's a little tighter in rendition. When he rendered his paintings life-size, his stroke was a bit looser, and what looks surprisingly photographic when it's examined upon close examination is surprisingly loose. Brian Bevan has put together a presentation that shows examples of that looseness, which became even more loose as Velazquez became older and matured in his late years. He came to be known as an alla prima painter, who, if he did use an underpainting, was very cursory in the rendition of that underpainting and rendered his paint almost like a sculptor. The lighter the value, the thicker the paint. The reason for that is if paint stands up in relief, it reflects light in many directions, and the painting becomes sculpturesque, so that if it's seen from a great distance, it just jumps off the wall. Unlike a Florentine painter, painting from the 15th century, where there was no texture and where the paint was all at a limited level, those paintings don't have quite the three-dimensional power that paintings have when the illuminated sectors have been built high in relief. And so we see a semblance of that in close examination of these illuminated areas, which is clearly defined in the presentation by Brian. We may very well have an early Velazquez here. It's signed with a different name, but X-ray analysis has pointed to another signature, almost in the form of pentimenti. It's coming to the surface. Pentimenti is an Italian word that was coined to mean a sin of the past catching up with you, and it was a directive of the maestro or master to his students to scratch off your dark mistakes. If you don't scratch them off, if you just paint over them, they may come to the surface later on and torture you in the form of pentimenti, because you won't be able to go down and fix them. There's an important painting by Velazquez of King Philip on a horse, which now has 5 legs because he didn't heed the direction of his master, just painted over the incorrect leg, and is coming to the surface centuries later to haunt him. I just think there may be a purgatory for all artists where we sit and watch the pentimenti coming up on our paintings after being forewarned. In this case, pentimenti may be an advantage to Brian Bevan because the original signature is coming to the surface, and he has X-ray analysis to prove that, and the signature is surprisingly similar to the signature of Velazquez. You may wonder, why would someone paint over such an important name and sign his name? It may have been to smuggle the painting out of the country, because if it had an important name like Velazquez on it, it would have been difficult to smuggle out. That may be the reason, but surely there is a signature beneath the topical signature that looks remarkably like Velazquez, and I congratulate Mr. Bevan for having discovered that and for putting together a couple of books of proof which may one day very well support his contention that this is truly a Velazquez original.